Hello and welcome to my Javelin painting tutorial. Before even thinking about paint, it's a good idea to take a microfiber cloth, dampen it slightly, and just wipe over the surface. This should remove any dust particles sitting on the top. Metallic paints reveal every flaw, so be thorough. The next step is heat sealing. Heat sealing closes up the cells on top of the foam, and hence prepares the surface for primers and paints. I would heat seal at a very minimum. Heat sealing does cause shrinkage in the foam, so you don't want it to shrink too much. It's a good idea before priming to also check that everything's glued right down. I went round all the detail and just felt around it. There was a couple of bits that had come up at the corner. If they do that, just grab some super glue and stick them back down. You're better fixing that now, as it's going to be a lot more complicated later. Before painting the Javelin, I'm going to prime it. The primer I'm using is called Flexbond. It's a clear and flexible glue. It gives a really good finish whilst retaining detail. To apply the primer, I'm going to use a selection of different paint brushes. This means I can change them up depending on what the detail is that I'm trying to prime. To use the primer, I pour a small amount into a plastic cup. Adding a tiny bit of water just makes it a bit easier to spread. If you go too thick with the primer, you can essentially lose some of the detail, so keep that in mind. With a small amount of Flexbond on the brush, I very lightly apply it to the Javelin. If you apply it thinly like this, you will minimise the brush strokes on it. Don't be put off if you can see some brush strokes, because I have a method of getting rid of them later. However, the least brush strokes you have now, the less you'll have to fix later. The Javelin has a lot of detail, so just try your best to get into all the detail. If you put too much Flexbond on the detail, just keep in mind that you might lose that detail. Another reason why we keep it really thin. You can see the Flexbond goes on white. When it dries, it becomes clear. This can help determine when it's actually fully dried. I'm actually going to apply 3 coats of the Flexbond. This is the recommended amount to get the best finish. You can still see there's a bit of foam clay near the end of my Javelin. I actually applied quite a lot of primer over that part, and it actually helped to blend it. So if you do have a slight imperfection there, you can actually use the primer just a bit more there, and you can smooth out with your fingers and water later. You can now add the first coat of Flexbond to the other side. I flipped mine round, but just for the purpose of this tutorial. Let each side dry for 30 minutes for the best end result. Now I add a second coat of Flexbond to both sides. Note that I'm going to prime the handle separately. This was due to the stands underneath, and because I found it handy to hold on to while priming the main body of the Javelin. Again, leave it to dry for 30 minutes. I now apply a third coat of primer. I leave it to dry for 30 minutes again. I'm putting some extra Flexbond here because remember there were some holes left from the transfer before we added the detail on. Some of this was still visible in those grooves, and I wanted to hide it. Adding some extra Flexbond here just allows me to level it out just a little bit. If you have a similar issue as me when trying to blend out the end of the Javelin at the foam clay point, you can actually use a flashlight on your phone. This will allow you to see much better with the light bouncing off the Javelin. Then you can fix that area further with more Flexbond if need be. I now move on to prepping the handle. Firstly, I check the edges and add super glue to any edges that have come up. We previously heat sealed the strap when adding texture, so we don't need to heat seal that. As before, I apply a thin layer of Flexbond all over the strap and the gold plates. Note that if you do add heat to this before priming, you will lose the detail. Flexbond is compatible with Worbla and foam and is therefore ideal for this whole Javelin. So you might notice once this is dry that there are brush strokes and imperfections on the surface. This is due to brushing the Flexbond on and the nature of how it dries. It doesn't self-level or anything like that. But there's a very good thing about Flexbond, and that is if you add more water to it, it goes back to its original state. So after I'd applied Flexbond over absolutely everything, I grabbed some water and just used my fingers and smoothed it all out. What I found was best to do was to take a minimal amount of water and actually use the length of my finger rather than the tip. Obviously the tip we've got fingerprints and I just felt like that wasn't really helping. The most important areas of the detail to smooth out would obviously be the flatter parts, because that's where you notice it the most. But I did actually flatten everything out, so even the smaller detail I did this process with. This technique is all about observing and judgment. I did originally plan on using a cloth, but what I found is that it was soaking up too much of the glue rather than just spreading it. Just to show you, this side has been smoothed and this side hasn't been smoothed yet, and you can see the difference. Next, we're going to paint the leather handle strap. To start, I take a black acrylic paint. This will serve as the base colour. I also take a range of paintbrushes and some water. Next, I grab a sponge. It means I can avoid brush strokes and I can blend out the paint easily. So I firstly covered the whole of the handle with the black paint. I try and keep the amount of paint I'm applying to a minimum. I'm applying this layer with a brush to get into all the little wrinkles. Obviously, there will now be brush strokes on the handle. So to remove them, I use the sponge and just dab all over the handle. Once that was dry, this is what it looked like. Next, I take an acrylic paint in the colour Burnt Umber. This colour is a bit like a reddish brown. I put some into a plastic cup, take the sponge and then dab it into the paint. I then remove some of the excess as I don't want to put too much on here. I want to gradually build up the colour and I don't want to lose the detail. I carefully dab on the paint. The reason I'm not using a brush and then dabbing is because I don't want lots of the brown paint to go into the grooves. I want that to remain like the darkest colour. And so by using the sponge, I'm only putting the colour on the very top levels. The wrinkles will look darker and more natural. When that was dry, I felt like it was lacking a bit of the red colour that I wanted. I wanted more of a reddish brown. So I took a cadmium red deep acrylic paint and I added some into the cup where I'd been mixing the brown. Then with the reddish brown, I dabbed that all over the handle again. The handle is starting to look a bit more red now. While you're waiting on the paint to dry, you can use some of that time to mask out for the next step, which is painting the main body of the Javelin. I just used frog tape for this as it's delicate and won't affect the primer or paint. Next, I take the black acrylic paint again. I mix some in with the brown and then apply it along where the straps cross over each other. Naturally, these areas would be a bit darker. It's how they would wear over time. I use a sponge to blend the darker colour. Once the start colour is dry, you can see it's actually enhanced the detail there. What I then do is take that darker colour very, very lightly and just tap it over the strap. This will create several darker areas and it'll just look a lot more natural. Leather like that would never be the same colour all over. We've added darker spots and now we want to add some lighter spots, almost like a highlight. So I take white acrylic paint and mix it in with the brown as before. I apply the lighter colour along the ridges of the strap, as these are the points which would wear naturally first. Then I go in with the sponge and dab them so they look a lot more blended. Please be aware of the brush that you're using. You really want to use a detail brush for this. Detail brushes are a lot smaller. I take some of this lighter mixture and again just dab it very lightly over some of the Javelin. I have a very minimal amount on the sponge. You want to get rid of as much excess as possible. Minimal is the way to go here. The reason I'm putting these extra shades on the leather strap is because there will be wear from holding it over time, so there will naturally be lighter and some darker areas. You can also see I'm using the cleaner side of the sponge to really blend it out. Now I'm happy with the way that looks and I leave it to dry. For the main body of the Javelin, I'm going to start off with a gloss black base. This is because I'll be using chrome paints on top of it. The gloss black base is really essential for the chrome paint because it really helps with the reflectiveness and the shine. So I set my airbrush as per instructions and I spray the gloss black evenly onto the Javelin. My advice is to spray the length of the Javelin and keep turning it so the coat is uniform. Make sure you apply medium coats, as light coats will not give the most reflective outcome. Originally I wanted to use spray paints to get the metallic colour, but after a few tests on several chrome paints, I found that the Alclad range was much more superior, mainly in terms of the shine it gave, and also the perfect silver and gold colours. Another thing that's quite good is you don't need to add a varnish on top. I chose to just leave this as it was. However, if you are using a varnish, you need to make sure you don't lose that shine. I know a lot of people swear by the 2K varnish that's used in the automotive industry. When I'm painting, I'm doing this in sections, so I'm going to do this side of the Javelin first, then I'll do the next side, then the plates. If I turn the Javelin, you can see exactly how shiny the gloss gets. With the gloss black, you might not find it shiny right away, it actually develops over time, so the shine just gets greater as it dries. Next, I take my chrome airbrush paint, I test the colour and spray onto a bit of kitchen roll. You need to make sure your spray is coming out of your airbrush evenly, so I would suggest testing it first. I set my airbrush to the correct settings and start spraying. The instructions with this is to spray lightly, so I just take my time doing light coats. You can see the silver colour is starting to come up. As before, I use the airbrush from one side to the other to make sure there is even coverage, and I turn it to reach the other areas. With the third coat, I really try to target any areas that don't look as silver. There is so much detail and it's easy to miss a couple of areas. I now leave this to dry for 24 hours to ensure the paint has completely set. You can see how shiny this has gotten with the chrome already. This chrome paint is really effective. Next, after masking out the main Javelin, I'm going to add the gloss black to the plates. I do the exact same as before with the same settings. You can see I've also used some masking tape and paper in between the plates. This is to protect the strap. Again, I leave this to dry for 24 hours to be on the safe side. Once the gloss black is dry, I go over with the chrome. To get the gold colour I want, I use a golden yellow candy. Candy colour is basically a transparent tinted enamel. I set my airbrush to the correct settings and then I go ahead and add the gold over the parts that have to be gold. You can see already the gold colour starting to come up. It kind of starts looking a bit bronzy to begin with, which is quite a nice effect, but I want it to be gold. So I'll continue adding coats until I reach the colour I want. After 24 hours, I do the same on the other side, and once that was dry, we have our Javelin. I hope you've enjoyed these Javelin tutorials, and I absolutely can't wait to see yours. Thanks for watching.